My name is Daniel O'Quinn, and I'm the host for the R18 Collective's Roundtable discussion on Against the Grain Theater's recent production of Messiah Complex. For some of the 200 people who signed up for this event, it's already nighttime. For many, it's the afternoon, and for others, it's the beginning of a new day. We've come together from many places. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet here on a virtual platform, I'd like to affirm the importance of the land and to declare our commitment to respecting and improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures wherever we may be. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation and other nations home. Please join me in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, to reckon with the ongoing legacy of settler violence, and to imagine how we each in our own way can move forward in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. In that spirit, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Renata.
Atitu, Atira Renata Arluk. So hello, my name is Renata Arluk, and I come to you from Treaty 7 territory in Banff, Alberta, Canada. I'm home of the Switchin of the Dene, Stoney Nakoda, Blackfoot, Métis Region 3, and traveling nations, outside nations of Cree and Tanaha and Inuit. I'm Director of Indigenous Arts at Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, and I'm also founder of Aki Peak Theater company that does Northern Indigenous based work. I'm the co-director of Messiah Complex with Joel Ivany, and I'm very excited and happy to be with you today, and I look forward to this great conversation that we're going to dig into. Masi choku yanik.
Joel?
Hi everyone, my name is Joel Ivany. I am zooming in from Treaty 13 territory, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and now home to many First Nations, including the Inuit and Métis people. I'm grateful to be here, and I am stage director, the artistic director of Against the Grain Theater in Toronto, and now we're movie makers as well. And that was kind of birthed out of this pandemic, but also we're very grateful to have been able to make Messiah Complex. But yeah, I am a father of two who you may hear over the Zoom session, so I'll try to monitor the mute as well. But yeah, we're all living here at home and excited to be here to talk about this this project, which has impacted so many, and grateful for artists like Renata and Leela who participated in it.
Bridget?
Tēnā I'm speaking from Takahoa Bay in Te Tai Tokoro, Northland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The takiwā is Ngāti Whātua, the hapu are Te Uri Oho. And in my life in America, I'm an associate professor in the English department at Vanderbilt University. And Danny is a long-standing colleague in the field, working together on theatre and empire. But I also have a very long-standing interest in Māori writing and theatre and poetry. So, tēnā koutou.
Ellen?
Hi, I'm Ellen Lockhart. I'm Skyping in from Toronto, where I'm the assistant professor of musicology at the University of Toronto. And I also am a mom of two kids who will no doubt be interrupting this at some point later on. So it's a great pleasure to be part of this panel.
Robbie?
Gwe, Taloisi, Robbie Richardson. Hello, my name is Robbie Richardson. I am Mi'kmaq, a member of Papineau First Nation in New Brunswick, Canada. And I'm also assistant professor of English at Princeton University, which is on traditional Lenni Lenape territory, but I'm actually coming to you from London in the UK, the center of empire.
And Leela?
Day, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Leela Gilday, and I'm from the Dene Nation, which is a very large nation, but where I was born and raised is Yellowknife Northwest Territories, which is the Yellowknives Treaty 8 territory. My family's from actually the Sahtu, though, so much further north. And I'm coming to you today from Edmonton, from Treaty 6 territory. I'm a singer-songwriter and a lifelong performer and lover of music, and really happy to be able to be here to talk about this really interesting project today.
Thank you, everyone. We're people at R18 are just thrilled that you are all able to be here together at this time. I'm going to make a couple introductory remarks and then we'll move things along. Produced in a time of emergency, Messiah Complex engages with the canonical work of the 18th century to address ongoing and specific emergencies in the lives of Indigenous and diasporic peoples in Canada. This remarkable return to past repertoires, not only reconstitutes and honors ways of being that were and continue to be derogated, but also envisions our shared future otherwise. My experience of viewing Messiah Complex was one of the heightened awareness of the potential for our present moment, of how performance, or maybe more pointedly, counter-performance, can broach the future without negating Canada's genocidal history. Through its conspicuous decisions about casting and location and language, Messiah Complex radically alters Messiah, cutting many of its arias, translating and radically reorienting others. And it does so in a way that opens possibilities that were largely foreclosed by Charles Jennens' libretto. Out of this most famous of Handel's oratorios emerges a complex meditation on systemic oppression that gives voice to precisely those who've been rendered silent or made invisible. Now, one of the things that struck me so forcefully when first seeing it was how thoroughly it brought all of this together at a moment when most of us were having difficulties getting anything together. It was such a remarkable thing to do. And I want to start by just turning to the members of the company, to Joel and Renelta and Leela. And I'd just love to hear from you some of your objectives and some of the challenges you ran into, some of the surprises or kind of revelations that kind of emerged as you were working, or as you were bringing the work to fruition.
Yeah, I think I'll just start it off quickly, if that's okay, Renelta and Leela. I think the pandemic obviously played a huge role in the development of this piece. Against the Grain Theatre, before this year, produced live theater. And one of the works that we had produced is a staged, choreographed version of Handel's Messiah, which we have done in 2013 and then revived in 2015. And as our company is growing, we're in our 11th season, we were looking to expand and grow that by bringing back one of the pieces which the city of Toronto really seemed to enjoy, because it varied very differently from the Taffel Music one or the Toronto Symphony version, simply because our goal is to create and introduce audiences to outside the box opera experiences. And that's what this one was. And over a year ago, when we realized that wasn't going to be possible, we were looking at how we could present this piece in a different way. And as many theater companies and performing arts companies across North America and the world were looking to take their content online, we were seeing, as well as content that we were doing as well, the successes and the parts where we were not so successful in putting content online. And it was only when I started seeing a couple, I guess you could say almost music videos, that I saw the potential of what could be done for a Messiah. And that was right around the time in July when there was a lot of protests around Black Lives Matter. And we were seeing protests in the NBA where players were not taking the court to protest what they were watching. And our company, Robin Whiffen, Kendra Miller, our board of directors, we were all sort of saying, what role can we play in supporting this movement? And again, I'm a white man in Toronto. And so that's where the idea sort of took formation in terms of taking a piece and supporting artists that haven't traditionally been lifted up and supported in this way. Also knowing that during this pandemic, artists are the ones who have suffered an incredible amount by cancellations of performance, the inability to tour, the inability to do what many people have trained years and years and years to do. And so we wanted to give a project to artists and support them in what they wanted to do. So it wasn't necessarily our company's goal, which it was, but also to hear from the artists and what they wanted to do with that project. And as soon as that could have involved Indigenous artists, that's when I approached Renalta to see from a Banff Center perspective what that could look like. And immediately she made it clear in a very supportive way, which we wanted to do as well, to bring her into the project to become a co-director on the film as well.
I'll pop in. Thanks, Joel. It's excellent. Yeah, so with some of the, we started having conversations about singers and just getting kind of going back and forth and like asking about certain singers, what do you think? And just kind of offering names with some of the people that I knew. And then the singer started reaching out and going, you know, it'd be really great to be able to work with you as well. And so I think we started with just a few people that we were chatting about. And then Joel was like, would you be interested in directing all of the Indigenous singers? And I said, well, I would just ensure that you ask and see if that's something that's interesting for them. You know, I don't want to feel like they have to be directed by me, but thankfully, like, everyone responded quite positively to it. And so I got really excited to be able to kind of dig into this work, and this is my first foray into opera and really into film. So, but I have done quite a bit of theater directing, so I felt confident in the text. I felt confident in exploring story within these pieces, and thankfully, I had traveled to quite a few of these places in Canada, so I was able to envision what these places look like and how best to engage land and story, which was really the main focus. And then ensuring that in the Indigenous soloists had great support filmmaker-wise. And I was really, really curious to hear how the soloists were interpreting the music for themselves, the relationship they had with the music, and so that I could help just really create that the space to be able to create and support and enliven those stories. And so I feel like a conduit more than a director in this process, but I felt like the tools were in place to allow that to happen in a really good way.
That's so nice and I'll hop in here. It's so nice to hear you speak from a kind of a macro perspective, Joel and Renalta, because I really was just involved in my own piece. And in fact, Bridget, you were saying, or maybe it was, I can't remember who was saying that many tears were shed when you saw the piece in its entirety. And that was the same with me. It was a surprise to me, like just kind of the depth and the breadth of what the performances covered. For me, my experience with this project came out of a long relationship with Joel. We've worked together over the last several years on various projects, although this is the first time he did ask me to sing. And I've just essentially, for me, projects that look at reconciliation, and I'm using air quotes because that word, there's a lot to unpack with that word, but projects that really have that, or a goal of indigenizing pieces or decolonizing, really have to start, for me, really have to start with conversation and with friendship, and that has to be the basis. If it was a random theater director or opera director that asked me to do this, I would have been very hesitant, and it would have taken much more investigation. But since Joel has a history of, and Against the Grain Theater have a history of extending an open invitation to invite Indigenous performers into their space and without expectation, I was very, really honored and quite challenged, actually, for me to take this project on. It allowed me to push myself. It came at kind of an interesting intersection for me of like returning to opera as a medium. I'm a singer-songwriter, so that's mostly my discipline. But I did study opera in university. And then also at this time, I'm doing a lot of language reclamation within my art. So I'm writing an entire record of all in my own language, which is, I don't speak my language, I'm just a language learner. So taking on this project and kind of disrupting the narrative, it was really exciting for me. And I thought it really gave an opportunity for ears that wouldn't necessarily listen to my music to hear something of my worldview and my own spirituality, and see our beautiful territory as well. So yeah, I thought that was my experience. I mean, in a nutshell. I could talk for the whole next hour, so I'll just leave it at that.
Oh, I'm sure there's going to be ways that's going to happen. Yeah. Our plan is I'm going to hand things over to Ellen next, and Ellen's going to make a few remarks, but then she'll be asking questions of you all again. So, Ellen.
Thanks, Danny, and thanks, Joel and Leela and Renalta for that introduction to your project. So I'm the music person on the panel. That's sort of what I'm going to be doing, basically, is trying to talk a little bit about the music without kind of recolonizing the discourse, and then shoot some questions at you after I tell you a little bit about what I got out of it. So from my point of view, this was very much a Handel's Messiah for the Anthropocene era, right? In that it comprises it is comprised of a series of rich and sometimes uncanny encounters between humans, landscape, ancient theology, new media, sometimes archives of new media, as in the case of Elliot Mador's marvelous hockey, skates, trumpet shell sound, and 18th century music from the first half of the 18th century. So that's way back there. So the literary critical term for what I experienced, what was at the forefront of my experience when I was consuming this is thick time, right? Where multiple time scales are invoked, both like human, experiential, historical, and then time scales far beyond the human experience, the geological time scales, the planetary time scales. And then there's this added richness to the project that comes from the COVID layer that is kind of always there and present in what we could call like the COVID fossils. All these things that are protecting us, like on the level of the moment and the breath, but will no doubt remain on the planet far longer than any of us will, like the plexiglass shields around the players, for instance. And then of course the music, which was written, which, as all music does, it asserts its own presentness when it's heard. But it was written 280 years ago. And already when it was written, it was already old-fashioned in ways that I'll talk about a little bit. So Handel, like most 18th century composers, would have broadly had kind of two styles that he wrote in. One was his kind of modern secular style that he would use for opera, instrumental music, and so on. And then he would have his sacred style, or the learned style, which was usually used for church texts. And the Messiah is in the sacred style, which is kind of audible everywhere, but it's most noticeable if you're not kind of constantly immersed in the 18th century world of, musical texts. It's most noticeable in the choruses, in these moments where first you hear a snippet of melody, and it's often kind of very geometric, almost mathematical sounding. And then a different voice type, a different part of the choir will enter with that same melody. And then a third part will enter with the same melody. And so this very, very complicated texture is built up and up and up and up. And the virtuosity there for the composer is to make sure that it all kind of still sounds right. And most of these movements that, as Handel wrote them in this secular style, also, like the Messiah complex itself, have like multiple time scales that are being invoked at the same time, right? So there's the meter, right? That like it's either duple meter or triple meter, or some combination of duple and triple. There's the rate of harmonic change, which is, but there's the surface harmonic change, and then there's a kind of slower below the surface harmonic change. There is the rhythm that comes from the words, from the poetry. And this is all kind of in the midst of the larger rhythm of alternation between the movements. And amidst all of this rhythmic or temporal heterogeneity, what stands out most to me are these sudden striking confluences, these moments where all these different fractured media or temporalities seem to come together for magical or kind of uncanny encounters. The first one that really struck me was Diet's her dancing steps in the snow, which is the first moment in the Messiah when you hear a dance like triple meter. Everything's been duple up until then, and triple meter is just like, it really has a kick after all that duple. The synergy, the unexpected synergy of hockey skates, gliding hockey skates, and melismas in Elliot Madoris, The Trumpet Shall Sound, or the Syrian Canadian Miriam Khalil's sacred Orthodox chant, which she remembers from her childhood in Damascus, replacing one of the recitatives. So the big question for me that hangs over all of this, I'm going to do the typical academic thing of asking you a question and then answering it myself, and then not giving you a chance to answer, and then I'll stop. So why the Messiah, right? I feel like that's a question that you start to answer in this, or you start to acknowledge that the question hangs over it, really even before the music starts, with this texted acknowledgement of like, we recognize that this is an immensely complicated piece for us to tackle in this way. I've thought about this, like, what does the Messiah give this project? And I'll tell you, this is where I answer the question I asked you. I'll tell you what I feel that it does give, and also why I feel that it's complicated. So the drawbacks are obvious, right? Robbie mentioned earlier that he's coming from the center of empire. And if there's one canonic musical work that also like comes from the center of and there probably is only one, because the English famously don't write very good music, or at least not until the 20th century, then it's this. This is the canonical piece. This is like a tank of the Western canon. It's in English, it's coming from the center of empire. For centuries, it is a piece of British propaganda, of English propaganda that is taken to the different corners of the empire. On the other hand, I feel like there are things about the 18th century oratorio as a genre that make it very fitting for this treatment. One of them is the temporal complexity that I've just described. And another, maybe more important, is this kind of vague multiplicity of voices that the piece has. Like, lots of people are singing, either by themselves or in groups, but it's never clear who they are. So that allows for a framework of new people, of Leela, of the other performers, to be present there in a way that maybe you could not have been in an opera. So the musical text is, on some level, able to accommodate these very characteristic performers without necessarily kind of enforcing a mimetic or fictional paradigm on them. All right, so maybe actually I have more, but maybe I'll just actually stop for a bit and get the three of you to talk about just why the Messiah, why Handel's Messiah.
Good question. Yeah, I think part of it was that how we had alluded to that was something that we were going to do. So part of that was just, we were hearing companies, everyone was postponing, canceling. Canceling's a bad word because postponing is better, because then it means it may happen one day in the future. So we were looking at that, and then the more we kind of, as the ideas kind of shaped itself out, it sort of, and it's really hard to look back at it now because it makes it so easy in some degree, but how it's all these kind of mini scenes that that do have sort of a narrative, but not necessarily. So it's kind of, in some ways, it's the perfect kind of introduction to this bizarre way of interacting with digital content online, because if you think of a 2-hour opera, like, you have to really kind of invest, whereas these were short little snippets that whether you knew that it would change every time, you kind of didn't know what was coming up next, even if you knew the order of the Messiah. And even the fact that we reduced it from its full length down to 78 minutes, people were kind of, what did you leave in? What did you leave out? Which is, again, one of Elena's questions. So it's kind of, there was almost a bit of not knowing what was coming up. We also wanted to use a title that people would recognize at a time of year during this pandemic that most people's traditions, which, and again, that's not to say this is Leela's tradition necessarily, but was that they listened to the Messiah every Christmas, and every orchestra pretty much in North America wasn't going to be doing a Messiah. So there was a lot of sadness in that, but we also thought that this could be a way to provide them with that tradition, but in a completely different way. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of why that was there. And I was really hesitant about how challenging that would be to our Indigenous people and performers, just because, because of what the past has done with residential schools. And I thought this could be, I think I felt enough that if people didn't want to participate, that was well respected, and some didn't, and but some did, and some performers like Diantha Edmonds in Newfoundland, the music and the language were so important to her through her family, and her dad taught her language but also taught her music, and so for her it was kind of the best of both worlds kind of coming together for her. But that is not to say that is the feeling across the board. And so we wanted to just be as supportive through this. And it was a bit of, only to comment on Elena's question about, or I guess a bit into Karen's about what we left in and didn't, it was a bit of musical chairs in terms of, we wanted to make sure that we covered different groups of people, but also which singer could sing which aria. The soprano ones, it's kind of, they're all hard. And so like Leela picked a big one. But it was kind of like, we wanted to make sure that Leela felt comfortable. And then we kind of saw where that went in terms of what other parts of Canada and what other singers we could do. And even from a musical perspective, we were only scratching the surface in terms of what could have been done. And so it was that fine balance of how far we could push things while still maintaining the semblance of something that is familiar. So even it was just interesting, even how you brought up dancing, and typically a chorus would come in and sing what she had been singing. And I remember one Zoom with Diet sort of saying, "Do you want a choir to sing Southern Shoshone this?" And she's like, "I don't think we could do that," because that would have taken a huge other feat in terms of, yeah. So things like that, it was just kind of interesting. And even, yeah, Miriam's as well. There were these little snippets where we just added to the music, which people didn't sort of necessarily bring up and say, "Hey, that's new," or "This is, where's this?" It was just sort of generally accepted, which is kind of nice as well.
I think there, and I'll just take it here. There's like a secular ownership of the Messiah that differentiates it from other sort of religious works. And I think, like, because I'm obviously not the person who made those decisions, like which piece, but for me, that kind of gave it allowed it into people's hearts that would necessarily have been turned on to another more religious piece. And also it's kind of left this back door open for people like me. So Joel came to me with this open invitation, choose an aria. And so the first one, he said, "What about this one?" I listened to it. I was like, there's way too many runs in that. I can't possibly make it through. So I chose a different one that I thought was very lovely. And then I completely rewrote the words. I actually threw the libretto out and rewrote it in English, and then helped my mom and my aunties help me translate it into, which in retrospect maybe wasn't the most ideal situation. I'm approaching my other writing a bit differently and starting in the language, but in this situation, that's what I did. And so it allowed me to kind of, bring in my own spirituality, which has a resemblance towards traditional Dene spirituality, which has been quashed and beaten and like attempted to, like, the extinction of our spirituality is still very much co-opted by the Catholic Church, but there are some semblances of, like, some of the ceremonies I perform in the piece are very traditional, like traditional Dene, not like before contact. So I think that it was almost not a blank canvas, definitely. I mean, it's but not as prescriptive as, say, another opera might have been.
Yes, I think some of the big conversations are like, why? Well, why not? Of course, you have to go the other way with it. And the other is that what is the intention of this music? And can we tap into what that true intention is? And can we respond to that with everything that we are? And, when we look at, like, my comfort zone is theater. So if we look at Shakespeare, people go, well, it's such a colonial playwright in such a colonial world. Well, if you look at the origins of Shakespeare, there was nothing colonized about him. He was a speaker of humanity. He wrote about circumstance, and he created life from many different levels. He wasn't a pleaser of the court always. He was a pleaser of he was like in the muck with the people. And you have to look at, what is the intention of this music? Was it to unite? Then excellent. Was it to inspire? Wonderful. Is it to reestablish, redefine, and re-engage in your own spirituality? Yes. And that's what the gift is of this music, is that, and of that era, is that we're able to respond to it, reflect on it, and reemerge with our own self-determined vision of what that is. And I think that that's what made this so dynamic, so engaging, is to see something that you think but you get to reconnect with it and actually have it be more real to you now than it ever was before that. And that's the gift of voice, and that's the gift of self-determined voice. And that was the main focus of of why I was interested in doing this. I'm not interested in regurgitating Handel. I'm really interested in breaking it apart, looking at it, and being able to provide opportunity for BIPOC Indigenous voices to sing their truth. That's huge, and that's the main reason why.
I think this might be a perfect bridging point to go over to Bridget now. Is that? Thank you, Bridget.
Sure, thank you. So my first observation is actually pretty coincident with the, I thought, wonderful question that Tracy Davis asked about shoes and boots and muklaks and, footwear and movement over the land. For me, looking at it, that was really what I responded to. And as I looked at it again, it just seemed to amplify. So, of course, we had Spencer Britton's amazing heels, those stilettos, and he has a story about what that meant to him, in terms of coming out. And Jonathan Adams, the way that I thought that was just, so great when the refinery work and narrative switches, when he takes off the boots, puts on the moccasins, and then the two spirit persons appear for us. And of course, in so many of the other segments, the muklaks are so prominent in dancing or pacing, moving with dignity. I mean, that the way that so concretely, visually, and also interestingly in terms of costume, which normally oratorio eschews, right? You don't have costume, but here the footwear and the placement of feet was incredibly important. And I guess, and of course the skates too, that wonderful magical moment when you seem to see someone flying. So what I was thinking is, it just seemed to me, I was prompted to think that this movement over land was emblematic of a very different, respectful, harmonious relation to the earth. Whereas, of course, the kind of extraction that we associate with colonial capitalism is the antithesis of that kind of movement. And, the brutality that's involved in extraction, refinement, all those industries, it seemed to me we are reminded of, with even though that's mostly absent. And that was very acute for me where I am now in Takahoa Bay, because the harbour out here, the Kaipara, for 100 years was deforested, and until very recently the water was brown, although now it's blue. So I thinking about this question of the relation of feet to land, I thought of a poem by Honi Tufare, a Ngāpuhi poet, and who wrote a poem called Papatuanuku about a hikoi, a land march from Te Tai Tokerau in the north to the bottom of the North Island. And he wrote, "We are stroking, caressing the spine of the land. We are massaging the ricked back of the land with our sore but ever-loving feet." So it's in a different register to the images that we saw, but that was very suggestive to me. So I did wonder if this was something that occurred to a lot of the performers independently, or whether this was something that you kind of thought about collectively. And I guess the second issue really echoes the large question that Ellen raised, the extent to which you all felt that this classic of Enlightenment musical culture, how could this be effectively repurposed? And I thought about this actually partly in relation to the fact that the presentation of sublime landscapes did remind me of some of the kind of celebratory early 18th century ways of their kind of, fantasies of the way that Indigenous Americans lived in the landscape. That was something that I thought about, but I also thought about the way that the placement in those gritty urban spaces where Spencer Britton and Catherine Daniels and Miriam Khalil and Raib Shaib were singing. That reminded me of a strand of Enlightenment theatre culture, which is not simply pro-imperial. For example, looking at Miriam Khalil's aria in the St. Raphael's ruins, which seemed to conjure up the desecration, the destruction of religious war, I was reminded of plays like John Hughes's The Siege of Damascus and also James Thompson's Edward and Eleanora, which are actually very critical of religious persecution and of religious bigotry. We, particularly in the academy, tend to think of the Enlightenment as the intellectual wing of European imperialism, and it certainly is that. And but there are some strands of critique in that theatre culture, and that's what I was reminded of in watching this. And I wondered whether you felt that the Messiah needed a completely wholesale, recasting and reinterpretation, or whether you also felt that there were aspects of the text that did provide for the, an articulation of expression of protest and of critique.
Great comments, and yeah. I know that in this, tell me if I'm addressing it correctly or not. I know that in Renelta and I Zoomed with many people, many of the artists, to talk about their videos, and obviously a big one with Diantha was How Beautiful Are the Feet, which we had talked about the land, we had talked about feet and sort of
migration. We talked about migration of caribou.
Yes.
So when I envisioned the How Beautiful Are the Feet, and just thinking about the land that she's from, and the moss and the lichen, I just went, what I see, Diantha, I see migration of caribou. And then I think that really just blew with her and Justin, the filmmaker. And then that's when that world became, and sorry, Joel, just to talk about like what they were wearing, Indigenous hands make all of our clothing. And so when you see in each of the videos, like you're seeing the texture and the time and the commitment created in those pieces, like the moccasins that Nathan is wearing, the beautiful coat and jewelry that Leela's wearing, the incredible moccasins and hat that Diantha is wearing. Those are all harvested and sewn and made with such love and comfort and celebration. And that was one big conversation that we had, was how can we show the incredible abilities of the community and what they create, and that beauty there. And I know Leela could talk about it too, but I know some of the conversations that Amos and I had, Amos Scott, who made her for Leela's piece, was, what does the future of Dene look like? Futurism. And you can't have the future without all of those incredible materials on your body, so that was just really the main focus. And then staying connected to land, often when we think of God or religion in that sense, it's always coming down, but in a very Indigenous ways of living is acknowledging that land comes through and up. And so, I mean, there's always, of course, all around, but that connection to land is so vital. So that's kind of where those came from.
And some of those were very intentional, and some just happened to uniquely work out with some of the videos where there was sort of details and sort of capturing of. I keep thinking of Louise up in Nunavut, where just her slow treading with the sun setting, and just it stops your breath in some ways just because you haven't seen that. But in some ways, that was just captured brilliantly, and not necessarily, not every video was storyboarded. There was some stuff that we just got very fortunate with, and it was wonderful just to see how so many there were 10 different film crews, and so how some of them, and Renalta and I weren't at all of them. So some of them we just had to trust that they would capture the right story. And inevitably that was just drawn into, there was always this sense of movement in all of the films, perhaps minus the choruses because there were so many people, but so that was part of it. And then, as it came to sort of saying, I think that was a bit of like a message behind some of those. I know that, that, for example, Miriam's piece was one that did, again, another one is Catherine Daniels, where why do the nations so furiously rage together? And just that text certainly had different meaning heard in that way at this time when you're hearing it, and by a voice who traditionally that aria or that song is sung by a bass baritone and not by a mezzo soprano, and she kind of owned that in a way that why doesn't that happen more often? So even just that changing, that was another sort of musical one where we changed, and there weren't too many, but of a piece of music that is traditionally sung by one sort of voice type, to just sort of awaken our eyes and ears to a new sense. And why do our nations so furiously rage together?
I definitely think that there is some universality in the Messiah just by virtue of it being, a spiritual piece. And though it doesn't embody my personal spirituality, there's universal truths that all of the religions have that speak strongly across the board. So for my piece, I know I threw out the text, but I did keep them, I know that my creator lives, and I know my Redeemer liveth is the name of the piece. But to me, that resonated with me still, though I differed from the actual, from the text that was there.
Yeah, the impact, Leela, of that, of people witnessing the smudging and the feeding to the fire was huge. Like, many people came to me to talk to me about how incredibly powerful that was. And, it's something like we know, like, the smudging is about being humble and being grateful, and to just be humble and open in that space was so powerful.
I was really hesitant about that because we don't generally, like, our ceremonies are not performative. So, and it was only because I was with a Dene film crew, like we were just, the three of us doing our thing. And these are like my brothers that I felt comfortable actually. I was doing ceremony in that piece. It wasn't like they were filming me, but I wasn't just like, okay, I'm pretending to smudge now. It was actually, or like, I'm pretending to feed the fire. No, that was what's on camera. There is a ritual, like a spiritual ceremony, 2 different spiritual ceremonies that we do.
Yeah, you could feel them. You could feel that. So and like, again, Diet dancing, like you could feel that inspiration that came from that moment. And I think that's where film is really powerful, to be able to capture those moments. And I just think about Jonathan too, with when we think about Diantha, knowing that history, connecting to language, to place because of her father, and that relation. The similar thing it was for Jonathan Adams, which was like he loves the text. That's actually that's his jam. Like, he loves singing that era. He's very familiar with it, very experienced with it, or they're very familiar with their experience with it. And then, the Refiner's Fire, like, not any word or music was changed in that. And we worked within the theme of connection that they felt with the text and with the music of its time. And so, again, just that intention and that perspective, how it changes something that actually remains unchanged.
That's so fascinating. We're gonna shift gears now and move to Robbie.
Great, thanks, everyone. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm in London. And I also mentioned that I'm Mi'kmaq. And so for nearly a decade, I've lived in the UK and have studied the history of Indigenous presence and representation in this ancient city. And I write about the interactions between Indigenous and British cultures and what subsequently gets produced in the contact zones between these cultures. So I want to offer 3 brief anecdotes or sketches to frame my thoughts and questions around this wonderful production. And the theme of each is reconciliation, appropriation, and material culture, which we've just sort of been discussing. So I'm not sure how much more we can talk about the material culture, but we'll see. So anecdote 1. As I watched the production of Messiah Complex, I was struck by the contrast between the 18th century Baroque music and the settings and the people that it inhabits. I should say it's a familiar contrast to me living in London. I'm reminded in watching your production of the fact that long before Messiah was composed, most English voyages during the so-called Age of Exploration in the 16th and 17th centuries had musicians with them. In 1585, the voyage of John Davis encountered Inuit in canoes near Greenland. And fearing they were hostile, he only had a small crew. He ordered his 4-piece ensemble to play for the Inuit. And the rest of the English crew stood on deck making, quote, signs of joy and dancing. One of the Inuit then began playing his drum along with the men. There's a utopian possibility embedded here, a moment of mutual respect and wonder, united to produce a transcultural song. Of course, we know, history tells us, our experiences tell us as Indigenous people, this moment of possibility was abandoned by the English in the search for wealth and dominion, domination rather. Can we reclaim this possibility? Anecdote 2. Jumping ahead, Handel visited London for the first time in 1710, before moving here permanently in 1712. Also in 1710, 4 representatives of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, visited London on a diplomatic mission in the most high-profile visit by Indigenous people of the century, and they were received by Queen Anne at St. James's Palace. A few months later, Handel would perform in the very same room for the Queen's birthday. London was still buzzing from the presence of the so-called 4 Indian kings, and they were still appearing in art, songs, poems, and periodicals. And I have to say, I wonder what Handel thought of them. So while the Haudenosaunee representatives were in London, taking in the sights and the musical theater and performances, they stayed in Covent Garden, in the home of upholsterer and theater servant, Mr. Arne. They were so grateful to their landlord that they gave him the name Gattarakwe, after the strongest fort they knew, which is now the site of Kingston, Ontario. Arne, or Gattarakwe, had an infant son while the native men were in his house, and 4 years later a daughter, both of whom would grow up with the familial memory of this momentous occasion of the Indian king's visit, and, most likely, portraits of the Indigenous men in their Covent Garden home. The son was the composer Thomas Arne, who would later compose Rule Britannia, the anthem of empire, I suppose. The daughter, Susanna, grew up to be the singer and actress Susanna Cibber, for whom Handel wrote the contralto arias in Messiah, which she sang at the premiere in Dublin. This is a faint outline, yet here we see a trace of a kind of cosmopolitan Indigenous presence. In 1977, the Canadian government purchased the official portraits of the Indian kings from the British monarchy, and Canada Post has since featured them on postage stamps. What was once a transatlantic Haudenosaunee history, the sovereign actions of Indigenous nations, then became retrospective Canadian history, part of an extended and mythic narrative of reconciliation. Finally, anecdote 3. The British Museum was founded in 1753, when physician, collector, and slave owner Sir Hans Sloane died and donated his vast collection to the country to form a museum for the public, not too far from where I'm sitting right now. But prior to this, Sloane kept his collection of artifacts, natural history specimens, and rare manuscripts in his London house. Handel is known to have visited and is said to have enraged Sloane by placing a buttered muffin on a manuscript and damaging it. But I also imagine him seeing the many indigenous objects which Sloane held, including Mohawk moccasins and ceremonial items from the Indian kings that are visible in their portraits, which are now in Ottawa, and the objects are still here in London. He also would have seen Cherokee baskets, tobacco pipes, wampum from various native nations, and the many indigenous medicines. Of course, we mustn't ignore the fraught colonial history that brought these objects to Sloane's London home, but I also consider their presence to be making an intervention in 18th century London. What did Handel think of these objects, these beautiful things that attest to indigenous skill, memory, knowledge, and survival? Could he hear their voices? So, leading from those 3 anecdotal questions, or anecdotes as questions, I'd like to sort of combine the first 2 into one, which is to say, in recalling the portraits of the Haudenosaunee, and in recalling that sort of potentiality of reconciliation, of true reconciliation, what do you think of this production being referred to as a very Canadian production, as Margaret Atwood called it, other reviews? Is there a danger that this can be appropriated into feel-good narratives of Canadian liberal multiculturalism, much like the notion of reconciliation for Indigenous people has been rendered almost meaningless in the face of boil water advisories, land disputes, and continued systemic racism? So that's a question for you.
That's a good question. Yeah. I think, as I've kind of been saying all along, that we didn't have the right answer. Like, this is not the perfect solution. And what this is hopefully meant to be is a step towards the right direction. And that's all that, I guess when you create art, that's hopefully what it is you put it out there. And I think, like you said, it's to be critiqued, analyzed, judged. And all I can say is good intention was put in there, that we hoped and felt that we did what was right. If people view that differently, or if it becomes something else, yeah, that's an interesting question.
I think it's always interesting to see it from the back end like that, and looking backwards versus how I see it from, as a progression of our relationship, into stepping forward, continually stepping forward. And, like I've said, reconciliation is not about us, you and me, feeling good together. It's about land back. It's about water rights. Like, that's what reconciliation is about. I think it's really important to recognize that. But while we're saying that, we can also repair personal relationships, and the arts is a very powerful way to do that. I don't like having my piece be characterized as a Canadian piece. But that'll happen. That happens all the time, especially overseas, especially outside the context of this country. I'm a Canadian singer. So yeah, that's a tough one, but I think, like, as long as we discuss it and parse it out in discussions like this, the less likely people are to sort of just blindly accept, oh, this kind of multiculturalism as the heal all, you know, and I like I said, I think the actions taken are actions that are forming relationships, and that is at the heart of like repairing our relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and between other communities as well, Black communities, people of color. You know, there's others at the table here.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, like people want to feel good about being Canadian. This is like really the ultimate, right? Like they want to feel good that they are in a country that is not racist, that is not colonized, that, you know, where everyone has equal opportunity. And we all know that that's not true. But that desire to have that, I think, is where that reparation is really that. Like I think if you ask anybody now after the TRC, do you think that Canada is a wonderful place for equal opportunity? I think people should be honest enough to say no. We have a lot of work to do, and so yes, Margaret Atwood going to BBC and saying this is a Canadian story, I mean, is a feel good, and sometimes we do need that win, but that doesn't negate the fact that there's still a lot more to do, and it is tough. I think what I'm hearing and what I'm tapping, like what I acknowledge is that if it was all Indigenous led, the voices would be a different conversation, and no one would be saying this is a Canadian conversation. Like no one would. They would say this is an Indigenous, you know, story led law. But because it's done through Joel's work, it has that Canadian aspect to it, because no one would ever say that Indigenous led is Canadian. They would say it's Indigenous, because I think we've done enough work now where we get identified as our own sovereign voice, which is really, really important to acknowledge. But what I really love hearing about Leela talking about Joel, and my experience working with Joel, is it is an open conversation. It's an open discussion. And I think that is something that helps fight against that Canadiana, because Canada to me sounds like it's done. Whereas open conversation, open discussion is a continual, ongoing relational building way of moving.
No, it's true, and it's a thing where, and I don't know if that's partly the film's title, like it's very complex. That, you know, what I've been taught and what is officially like the land of Canada incorporates all that land as it's known today, and there's issues with that we hear about, and so it's. Yeah, we wanted to make sure that we highlighted, not obviously, as Renelta kind of said, not just Indigenous stories, because that would be a different film, that would be a different interpretation, but to show how different our country is. We see sort of a Muslim woman praying in Montreal, and that doesn't look that different from a Christian person praying, versus it doesn't visually look a little different from Leela, who is performing her ceremony as well. And it's kind of, oh, that I recognize that, and I recognize that, and we are sort of similar, even though we are very different. So I think I do agree that it's not an easy answer, but it's hopefully a step towards what we want, which is reconciliation. That's what our company wants, and yeah. But my goodness, a great question.
I'm going to just jump in here as a transitional mode towards entertaining questions from the audience. Well, one of the most fascinating things about this entire production is that it alters your expectations of what Messiah is. So you're remembering arias that aren't being performed. You're suddenly anticipating things that you weren't expecting to see, right? And there's this, is this aria going to be in an indigenous language or not, right? So that fracturing that I think Ellen raised in the beginning, that there was this complex layering of time, right? When I was watching it, I was involved in this kind of complex historical analysis and also imaginative analysis of what could possibly be, what future could come, right? And I think a lot of that had to do with the way that language operated, the way that sound operated. And what I want to do is turn our attention to, we've invited a few prearranged questions. And I'm going to ask Misty, who's doing the tech for us right now, to bring up the first of the questions. It's a question from Lynn Festa, professor in the English department at Rutgers. And she addresses the question of language quite directly. She says, the plurality of voices and languages that one encounters in Messiah Complex offers the potential for a kind of democratizing polyphony, but it also recognizes that we aren't reciprocally transparent or immediately intelligible to one another. The shift from one language to another affords immediate comprehension for the speakers of these languages, while offering translations in the subtitles. So she was wondering, because I'm reading her, she was wondering what considerations entered into the subtitles. The translation from one language to another, the way the subtitles offer meaning, but also underscore that which is untranslatable across languages. How the subtitles enter into the relation between word and music, right? And the significance of the projection of words over the visual landscape, right, in the pieces. I'd love to hear anyone speak to this.
Yeah, I guess when it came to the subtitles, it was one where, for those who sang in a language that wasn't English, we asked each artist, one, would you like to have subtitles as part of your as part of the presentation, knowing that in some ways reading subtitles is sort of distracting a little bit. It can be, but also they help in sort of understanding, and especially as there was reinterpretation of text from Leela and Diet and Diantha, that we wanted that to kind of be there as well. So some chose not to have that, and that was not a technical, it was a choice. So when it came to writing what that was, a lot of it came from the artists themselves in terms of what text. And I'm sure Leela can speak to that in terms of how difficult in some ways that was to find the exact English word, or vice versa, when you were going back to translating back to English.
Yeah, that was, I think in retrospect, I probably wouldn't have chosen to do subtitles. And that was something that we moved forward with. And then I was like, yeah, I want them. And then now I'm like, because it was very reductive, I found. And really, I mean, like, I can appreciate that there's a distillation of meaning, but also the English words don't necessarily capture like the worldview, and that's embedded in the language. So I think there's, lots of issues with, I mean, I encounter those issues myself as a language learner, somebody who, my mom didn't speak English till she was 10, but she never taught us, because of residential school, she never taught us our language. So, I'm continually playing catch up, like, what does this word mean? What does this Dene word mean? And then it'll be like 25 English words or a concept. So when dealing with lyrics like that was extremely challenging to be able to kind of fit the music. And I stuck to the original melody with my piece. So fit the lyrics in there in a way that was complementary, like the prosody was correct and like the meaning was still captured. But I think looking back at it, the English subtitles don't capture everything that I said and everything that I expressed. But maybe that's okay.
That's interesting to hear because, of course, it makes complete sense that the intention of the language is never captured well, like with English translation, and that's so true. With Diet, we use surtitles. With Louis and with Diantha, we didn't. Diantha purposely chose not to have translation, and the purpose was coming from a conversation that we have in our communities is how our language speakers are often in places where they don't understand the language being spoken around them, and the effort of surtitling and translation are not given. And so it's responding to the colonial structure again, which is I don't want to bend to the colonial structure, so I'm going to sing the song and that you could feel the song and hear the song. And they were direct translations as well, just to support your choice, Leela. Like Diet and yourself translated those words and then translated them into the language and then translated back. And that's a bit different. So I don't want you to feel too hard on yourself. Like, I think it was a good choice. But for Louis and for Diantha, like, they were direct translations. They didn't readapt them. They translated them in Inuktitut. But for Diantha specifically, that was the choice, was to absolutely not have surtitles.
I was really fascinated when during actually it was during your piece, where I was suddenly remembering the Jennings libretto. Like, you weren't singing those words, but they were there. And so I was really sensing how you were overwriting them. It was kind of an amazing thing. I want to turn to the next question. Misty, could you bring up, this one's a little bit long, but I think it's quite important. This is from Jennifer Henderson and Anna Hofniggles. They decided to collaborate. They're both in the School of Indigenous and Canadian Studies at Carleton University. Says Messiah Complex refuses what has been called the ethnographic entrapment of participants in a display of diversity for the consuming eye of an unmarked center. We see Indigenous participants wearing nation-specific clothing and engaged in land-based practices, but they're interpreting an iconic piece of classical European music. Similarly, Britain and Khalil, Shaib, the sequences strongly remark, and especially in the case of how you reorient the handle. Nonetheless, we noticed a difference between the sequences with Indigenous and diasporic performers. The Indigenous sequences develop universal themes of the importance of land and of acknowledging a higher being, while the diasporic ones have a strong critiques of Canada. Chaib reflects on the pain of racist ostracization. The ruins that Khalil walks through make us think of the bombed out and occupied settings globally that have led to global migration. Britain exalting in the valley of Vancouver's gay village asserts a joyful intersectional identity that counters the violence of certain discourses of nature. And all three of those critiques, if you think about it, seem to come from intimate places. Very interesting. So what does it mean that indigeneity is associated with an all-encompassing reparative universality, while diasporic identities hold the sharp edge of critique? And I'd love to hear everyone on this. I think it's a very interesting question.
I'd like to take this one, actually, if you don't mind. While I respectfully agree that the diasporic identities did hold a critique towards Canadian society, and like there were some specifics pointed out there, I disagree that I don't see how you could get universal reparative narrative from our pieces. Particularly with mine, when asserting my traditional spirituality goes against, the last couple hundred years of residential school, trying to expunge it. To me, that is an act of criticism. And while obviously my piece was celebratory, just the fact that I was able to do that without being arrested or charged, as in the past would have happened in some cases, is an act of protest. So I mean, I'm sorry. I'm sure they didn't mean it in this way, but when I read this question prior, I got a little bit, got into a bit of a huff because I was like, I don't see that those were the only critiques that were available in this. I mean, obviously, was it Jonathan Adams' piece? Their piece talks about extractive land practices and how impactful and how horrible those are. I think there's a lot of criticism that happened within our pieces, and not just kind of a, I don't know. I think I'm repeating myself, so there we go.
I'm jumping on that, and I think it's because it's not right, there's no protesting in the streets, which we do on a regular basis when those injustices are happening. But even just the fact that Diantha's wearing seal, that Louis is wearing seal, like eat seal, wear seal, like they are still not allowed, are still not allowed to sell seal internationally because of European pressures by Greenpeace and other organizations that see that as a form of abuse. And so those were some of the conversations we were having with Diantha and Louis, was wear seal, like show that, so that we can normalize it and celebrate that in these spaces. So yes, absolutely, I agree with Leela that there was a lot of that part of the conversation and shown in the film.
Yeah, I agree with Leela.
All I can say is that, looking at it from Aotearoa, that came over to me loud and clear, as I think I said. That seemed very resonant.
I guess the reason why I wanted to put that question out there, or that their question seemed valuable to me, was that one of the most stunning moments in the production is when we suddenly shift gears into Montreal, right? And suddenly we're now talking about the intersectional discussion, right? So we're now, not only are we dealing with Indigenous politics, right, but we're also dealing with the aftermath of the hijab legislation in Quebec. It was a really I would say daring moment in the production, right? Because it suddenly became something much more complex, and didn't allow itself to be turned into a polarized entity, and it's precisely in there that you can't simply say that, oh, this is the Canadian thing, right? It's this. Suddenly it was all of these things. And so, yeah, the question is very, very, very polarized, right? But it's, I think it is trying to get at something about that interesting moment where we're basically in part two of the libretto, and things are changing quite rapidly. Is that worth discussing any further, or should we move on to the next question?
Yeah, only to comment on that language. A big thing around rehabs as well was how, just in terms of language, even how she changed he to she. He was despised, she was despised, and sang it in French. Whereas, again, what Leela and Diet and Diantha, again, they changed the context of the whole, not just the language, but the context of who in theory, it's a different God, like, dependent on what that is, for what that is as well. And why is that as not a big a deal from changing Jesus to he to she? And it was just kind of interesting. And so I think, I think that people got excited about sort of, I think because of maybe it being closer to whether that was English into French with just a shift of words. But I think, there was big protest in just simply changing the language as well.
Here, let's shift into the third prearranged question. It's a little bit more specific. This also comes from Jennifer and Anna. It says, in a few sequences, we get to hear the site-specific sounds of the places in which the videos are being recorded. For example, in the opening Spencer Britton sequence when he's on the land, he's on the edge of English Bay, I think, right? We hear the water lapping, right? These were moments where the emphasis on place was brought into the sonic experience of the viewers. However, overall, the emphasis on place is more visual. If more interference had been run through the incorporation of the immediate sounds of place, what difference would this have had to loosening the boundaries of this classical piece?
I think it would have loosened more. It was a thing where I think it wasn't, some of it was intentional and others wasn't intentional to not include it. I think when it was included, it was kind of, wow, this sounds really cool. I think Jonathan's piece, to hear the chopping of the wood almost in time with the music. Diantha's, which ends in the rush of waves it was very cool. And in some ways, yeah, we could have had more. And I think part of that was not intentional to leave out, but just wasn't included simply to the fact that we had to put this together in a very tight timeline during a pandemic. And yeah, again, it was our first film. So I wish it were more academic per se, but was just lucky in some degree. And I think we do things differently the second time, because I thought that those sound effects were great.
Yeah, I'm going to redo my piece, Joel.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, I thought that was a great idea. Next time I would do it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, just a little anecdote, like with Jonathan's piece, we actually were playing the music while the wood chopping was happening so that Nathan could build up that fury that he needed to be Superman wood chopper. Like, unbelievable.
Yeah.
And so it really carried it. We were glad it was able to make it through.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So, Misty, are we able to bring in a question from the audience now?
Yes, that would be a great idea. And those are in the Q&A section. Would you like me to read them?
Yes, please.
So we have a question from Elena Delgado. What was the inspiration or vision which guided your choices of those movements of Messiah you chose and which you did not include?
Yeah, I guess quickly, the choices of which numbers, the Toronto Symphony Orchestra who played with us had, they kind of gave us a time-ish, about 70 minutes. Part of that was, it was their first time, this is not the reason why, but it was their first time playing since that initial sort of lockdown in early March. So we were looking at a timeline of about 70 minutes. And when we decided we wanted to try to feature every province and territory, that sort of, if you assigned 13 numbers and then included a couple, at least sort of the top 3 or 4 choruses, that sort of got us to that ballpark number. And then it was simply which numbers are not hit, some of them that are hits that people would recognize, and that others could also sing comfortably. And so that's kind of, it wasn't too intensely thought through. It was more mechanical in terms of getting the right number, the right flow, the right number from each sort of part, as Danny mentioned. So that's kind of how we got to what we got. And we were glad to, again, like Miriam's piece is not generally, there's certain traditional cuts that are done, and we're glad to bring in a couple numbers that aren't traditionally performed as well.
Great. I'm coming on so I'm not a disembodied
Nice.
anymore, asking these questions. So we have another question from Karen Hurley, who is celebrating the role of co-directors, which is not seen that often, especially in film production. So well done. How did the co-director role feel to you all during production and in post-production?
You want to answer this one, Renalta, or no? It was awful. No. Yeah, just kidding.
This is the first time we've spoken in many months.
Yeah, exactly. Contractually obligated. No.
I'm a very collaborative person, so I work very collaboratively with everybody, and I have co-directed a few times. This is my first time co-directing with Joel, so I was like really curious to hear about your experience.
Yeah, I would say again, it was odd because it was on Zoom. Like Renalta and I never physically were in the same space. A lot of Zoom sessions, a lot of calls. We tried. I think it worked really, really well, considering how weird it was. Again, which kind of alludes to some of these other questions. How again, this was all done in a pandemic with provincial and territorial restrictions in place. So. I know that if and when we get to work again together, it's going to be different from this one as well. But I think collaboration is key, and that was kind of what was great. Is this wasn't just this is how I want to do it. It was more how are we going to do this, and how can we support one another, and just sort of getting what each other needs. So it went really, really well, which I'm open to doing a lot more of.
Yeah, and we kind of took on different roles. So it wasn't like, I think what you did a lot of, I wasn't in there, and what I did a lot of, you weren't in there. But when we were in there together, we came in with those different minds. And like, I think if we were both on set together doing things, I think that might be a little different. But I think I feel like it would still go well.
Yeah, agreed.
Fantastic. We have another production question about how the singing was recorded. Did you record live? Did you dub, some combination?
Sure, I'll take this one. Yeah. So I got the backing tracks from my backing band, the Toronto Symphony. And and in my home studio, I recorded, because this pandemic, I took on the producer role. So got a bunch of equipment. I recorded my own lead vocal and then mixed it down. And we, in shooting the piece, because our locations were mostly outside, we just played that through a speaker, and I kind of lip sang, tried to time. I was actually singing during the shooting, but I couldn't sing too loud because I had to hear my recorded voice and sing to that as well. Just easier to get a good clean sound without environmental interference, to do it in that way.
That's great. Thank you. The next question comes from Alexa Wallachon. And she asked, Robbie's stories pointed to the slave trade, and Leila mentioned the need to also remember other stories and experiences, including Black people and people of color. How did your production team wrestle with Handel's participation in the transatlantic slave trade? What place can or should that difficult conversation have in the discussions like this webinar about the project? As this project is part of a bigger conversation about relationships, respect, and reciprocity in what is currently Canada.
Yeah, it was interesting in researching this and how in the last few years, and I should know his name, but I don't, he's a big advocate of about how Handel had stock in the slave trade, and it's not more generally known because it's not written about as much. And it was known as part of that. And I think, what place should it have in this difficulty? I think it should be part of that conversation. Definitely. I don't, people, times were different in this or that, and that's fine to say things like that. But I think that brings about things about how should we just not perform certain works. We're seeing that with certain actors and things like that. And there's no easy answer to that as well. So I think it definitely should have a place. And I think webinars like this are great places to talk about it and discuss and sort of see how we move on from it. Educating our people is obviously a big part of it, and self-education is a big part of that as well. I don't know if that answered that correctly.
If I could just sort of, might bring in Ellen here as well, because she probably knows this better than I do. But one of the most fascinating things about Handel, right, is that, well, Messiah was first performed in Dublin, so it was first performed in a colonial context. Right? Not very, that's talked about all the time, but it's not very often discussed in terms of colonialism, right? And many of the oratorios, Judas Maccabeus, Israel and Egypt, quite frequently, the members of the East India Company got up Judas Maccabeus at the drop of a hat to celebrate Cornwallis's victory over Tipu Sultan, right? There's Handel's work. It's not simply like Handel's participation in the slave trade is something that is in many ways ubiquitous within the 18th century culture. If you've invested money in X place, right? But his work also, right, is part of this very complex set of problems that I think is only really now beginning to be discussed. Is that accurate, Ellen?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny my sense from working with performers is that performers tend to care about the composer and what he wanted and what he thought much more than academics do. For us, we're so used to setting aside the author, it doesn't really matter what he wanted for the piece. The piece is, after it's sort of, out in the world, it has a reception history that's much more kind of interesting in terms of defining what the accumulated meanings are of the piece. So for me, like it's a point of, it's interesting, and obviously, another data point of English colonialism that Handel was an investor in the slave trade, which we really haven't. We only found out about this sort of 7 or 8 years ago, when a researcher just stumbled on his name, and there's a suspicion that he actually got a lot of his colleagues within the musical scene in London to also invest in the slave trade. So, I mean, but Handel, he's. I feel like this kind of project can pursue its aims and politics to some degree, detached from what Handel would have cared about or wanted, because that's certainly how in musicology we conceive of the work. I mean, I could talk there's so many things to say about Handel. I mean, he's one of these figures that kind of fades in and out of focus for us. Like, for a long time, he's very much overshadowed by Bach, who's born in the same year. Then, with the advent of queer musicology in the 1990s, early 2000s, we get a much more interesting, like, sensual version of Handel that people can really start to identify with or like in some way historically. And now he's kind of, again, shifted into this kind of distant figure. Yeah, that raises more questions than answers, except that I feel that as artistic creators, Renalta, Joel, Leela, I hope you don't feel beholden to him as an object of care or respect, because I certainly don't.
That's perhaps a wonderful place to end the question. There were a few more in the chat, and so I will just add that we have been recording this conversation, and we are going to make it available once we have a chance to correct the transcript on the R18 Collective website. For those of you who are wondering how to contact any of the academics on this conversation, I will make sure that I list the names and university affiliations when we post it, if you have a follow-up question, so that you might be able to ask it. So I'll turn it back over to Danny. Thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I'm gonna, I just want to do 2 things very quickly. I want to thank all the people I can't see. There's all sorts of you out there. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I want to encourage you actually to go to the Against the Grain Theater's donations page and make a donation. This is a very difficult time for performers. I don't think we have an arrangement for a tote bag to be sent your way or anything, but you'll know that you've done something good. And to everybody I can see on my little Zoom thing, I want to thank you so much. You've offered all sorts of incredibly valuable commentary on this work, and you've also produced something incredibly important, So I want to thank, on behalf of all the people I can't see, thank you for being here. And maybe can we give ourselves a round of applause? Is that allowed? Is that allowed? Okay. Anyway, thank you, and have a good evening.